Hi everyone, episode whatever, I think 8. Today will be anxiety and lactate. There's something that I've been looking at lately that is, I found fascinating. It allows us to go into what is anxiety and how to deal with it in a better way. Most of what I see out there toward anxiety is anxiety, like a disease, something you catch, something you have, a psychological way of looking at the world, all those views on anxiety that I think are completely wrong. Anxiety is a function. I don't see the body doing anything outside of just as a function, right? There's no reason for nature to give you something good or bad. Everything has to have a function, right? And anxiety is a function. Anxiety is just is stress in the sense of pent-up energy that is being put out there to be spent on something toward the outside world, right? So if we look anxiety in this framework, we understand that anxiety is just energy that is to be spent on something that is potentially a threat to us, or at least something we need to spend energy on toward the outer world, right? That's what anxiety is. And so I have two people that I know, coaches of mine, that had they're not necessarily anxious, and that's where it gets interesting. But they had symptoms of high anxiety. So they had symptoms of panic attacks. One of them had a heart rate that would not come down. Someone who usually has a very low heart rate that suddenly ended up with spike on the heart, like, you know, when the heart beats like super hard and staying around in the 90s. Right, so when your heart rate, normally let's say 50, 60, and you're in the 90s, you think heart attack. So he goes to the doctor, hospital, none of that. There's a small murmur, but basically the heart is fine. But still, the heart rate stays up and stayed up for a couple of days. On the other thing, my other coach was doing great on the protocol, but still training very, very hard. But like issues, for example, with water retention, with not necessarily losing the weight she wanted to lose, even though her nutrition was on target. And also some physical pain in places that to me was describing anxiety symptoms, but more in the sense of almost like panic attack symptoms, right? So what I asked both to do is to take their lactate level at rest. And very interestingly, both of them were at 6.0, 6.1 millimole levels of lactate at rest. So you understand what that number means. When I was at a seminar, and because we have a lactate testing kit at the gym, I tested my lactate normal levels at 1.0. This is me doing a seminar, so, you know, like moving around, but in a calm state. Still having to talk to people, so it's still, you would think, a little bit higher than my normal lactate level. So 1.0, which actually is fairly on the low side. Most people are around 1.5. People being under 2 for the vast majority, right? And so I'm deciding, we're like, oh cool, let's do an experiment. We're going to test everybody. Right, so we start testing people on their, it was during Coaches Week, not a seminar, sorry. And then I'm asking my daughter to do the test, and she doesn't want to, because Richard didn't want to because he doesn't like needles. And so he goes, and I'm starting to get pissed at Yaya, right? I'm like, will you please do the test, because I need to see where you are, it's important, I want to see you. And 5 minutes later, she still doesn't want to do it. So now I'm pissed. I'm, slam my fist on the table. I'm not always the most patient father, I agree. And then, we get pissed, whatever. I calm down, right? I take 3 minutes, nasal breathing, calm down and everything. And then everything is back to normal. I'm like, I'm curious to see something. Let me do the lactate test again. So poke again. And at that time, my lactate levels are at 3.5. So I had triple my levels of lactate in the blood, right? Just by going into a confrontation. That did not result into a physical fight, but still the confrontation was there, right? So the need to expend energy toward the outside world was there. Sympathetic reaction, very much so. I got angry. Woof. Levels of lactate shoot up at 3.5. Now, so you can see triple levels is a fairly large amount, right? But that's after calming down, right? So when I was at the top, I was probably like in the 4 and the 5. So at my angriest I would have to test, my guess was I was in a 4 or 5 without a physical component. So what does it matter? Because this shows you that the mental approach can actually raise the lactate level just by itself. This is something we measure in runners, like Wim Adistov, who has a lot of marathon runners and endurance runners, tested, and at the time he told me that the anxious runner versus non-anxious runners had levels of lactate at rest that were, one was double or triple the other. So the anxious runners had double to triple the level of lactate at rest that is non-anxious runners, right? So that becomes very interesting, because if you test people when they do, let's say, the sled sprint or things like this, you see also high levels of lactate. So why? Well, for a very simple reason, is lactate is a fuel. Lactate is not a waste product, lactate is a fuel. So lactate is a fuel being produced in any sympathetic reaction, right? Because, for example, glycolysis, taking glucose into lactate produces ATP that we need. And then that lactate will go into the cell and is being transformed into pyruvate for the, and then after that, oxidation of the cell, all that stuff happens. Like I don't have the time to go into all this. I've done podcasts on the subject, right? So lactate is an extremely important fuel. The brain runs on lactate as well. So anytime you have a need for expenditure of energy, so any stress will require the lactate levels to go up, glycolysis to start pumping. So you take at it. So you understand that physically, whenever I do an effort, lactate goes up, but even mentally, when I go toward a sympathetic reaction, lactate levels goes up. So to come back to my 2 coaches, imagine if me, after a fight, I'm at 3.5. Imagine the life they have walking around at 6.1. So we know that when people are anxious and you give them lactate, you end up in a panic attack mode. Why? Because fuel, and then more fuel, and then more fuel, end up with so much fuel that the system becomes dysregulated. That dysregulation means that the system starts to feed itself until it has a snowball effect and just goes downhill and nothing can stop it. We see that a lot within the system. This is why I always talk about balance, because when you start to push too much on one side of the arch or the other, things get dysregulated and the swing starts to get greater and greater and greater, and the whole system starts to crash. So we see that with anxiety. Because anxiety, at some point, if it's not dealt with, they just create more and more of itself until you end up in a panic mode. So I believe that's what was happening to my 2 coaches. At 6.1 resting levels walking around, it's a panic attack mode. Except they don't feel it as panic attack because they're constantly there. But that doesn't mean their body doesn't feel the panic attack. It just means that their conscious mind cannot see it. Why? Because of that fifth hierarchy that I talk about all the time, the amygdala being there, is like there is no more fear associated with the situation because they're in it every day. If you're in a situation, no matter how bad it is, every single day, and you don't die from it or you have no physical threat from it, you will get used to it to the point that you put it in the back as an unconscious thing, not as a conscious thing, because the body does not feel the need to deal with it on the conscious level. And so you end up in a panic attack that your body feels, but your mind doesn't. And so I believe that's where they were. So there's massive issues with having such high levels of lactate. First of all, that means the fuel being there is going to have to be spent. Your entire body is in a panic attack mode. Again, regardless of whether you feel it or not, it's not that. Your body is in a panic attack mode. So hence, for my coach with a heart rate that starts to spike up. That was also the way he was training. A lot of strong feet, burn the question, and stuff like that. So teaching the body to spike the productions of lactate, so feeding the panic attack constantly. On the other side, from our other coach, what do we see? When there are high levels of lactate in the body, it stops lipolysis from happening. Right? Lipolysis, I think. Lipolysis is burning fat for fuel. Right, so that means if you have constantly high levels of lactate in the blood, you cannot burn fat for fuel. So you could burn the fat that you ingest for fuel, but you cannot use the fat reserve, under the skin for fuel. So that will explain why people that are stressed out, first of all, gain weight from water retention, which is a sympathetic reaction, but also cannot burn the fat that they accumulate because lipolysis is being stopped because of the high levels of lactate. Right? So that means that How do we deal with this? So that frames, all this frames anxiety, like on that case, from a pure like physiological point of view. Now, none of what I'm going to say about, because what I'm saying is that if we deal with lactate, we deal with anxiety. Well, that's not true either. Everything is a feedback loop. But the main point of all this is that you're going to have to fix a situation that causes you to produce the lactate in the first place. So I want to talk about how we can deal with anxiety from an exercise perspective. But it does not change the fact that you are in a situation that creates those high levels of lactate. You have to fix that situation. The environment you're in causes you to mentally, if you know what I mean, create the lactate. You need to change our environment. Otherwise, you will continuously produce the lactate, so you will continuously be in a panic mode. Now, on the other side of that, are there things we can do to deal with such high levels of lactate so that I am not in a panic mode anymore? What we can do is take you from a panic mode to simple anxiety. Now, that simple anxiety will never go away because you need to fix the environment. But at least you won't be in panic mode, right? Anxiety is better than panic because at panic, you start to have major physiological symptoms that actually hurt your body. So we can take you down from that. It won't fix anxiety completely because to do that, you need to deal with the environment. But how do we deal with such high levels of lactate? So we have two ways of doing this. On the subject, I do believe there is something about high levels of lactate in the blood that the body sees as extremely harmful. I can't prove that. I don't see papers on the subject, but lactate is a fuel. It's not supposed to be in the blood. And I've seen a number of reactions from many different directions that shows you that that when lactate stays in the blood, it seems to be something that freaks out the body. It is not supposed to happen like that, right? So the lactate is supposed to go to the muscle, to the brain, to gluconeogenesis, to many different levels, right? But it is not supposed to stay in the blood like this. Maybe that has to do with gluconeogenesis. That then would be just too much fuel for that. That would create futile cycle. Is that why? I don't know. Honestly, at this stage, I don't know. My guess is you're not supposed to have the lactate in the blood. It's supposed to go into certain places, but not stay there. There's even a relationship between lactate and water, but anyway. So how do we deal with such high levels of lactate in the blood? We could start with Disney December, obviously, because it'll make the blood flush around, and allow the system to move and to use a little bit of that lactate, right? That's while we do the Disney December. The Disney December is also going to promote the parasympathetic side, which will limit the sympathetic side on the other side and therefore limit the production of lactate. So you'll be able to monitor a little bit the levels of lactate doing that. More importantly, not maybe more importantly, but on the side of that, what we need also is to help people use lactate as fuel effectively. How do we want to do that? Well, that's easy. That's cardiovascular capacity. So what we need to do is we need to build a better cardiovascular capacity. So we need to start, for example, 20 minutes, which is what I've been doing and testing, 20 minutes of running, but not in a Disney December form. This one we want to push, right? We want to do like a max distance with a specific breathing. So for me, it's all about the exhale, because it's about the CO2 way more than about the oxygen. So when you run, think exhale. So the trick for me is to not have a gap between exhale and inhale. So I don't go pause, inhale. I need to have exhale straight into inhale to force my exhale to be full. Anyway, I'll do other videos on this. But the point will be to have a cardiovascular capacity workout. So go run for 20 minutes, push the pace, a fairly high heart rate. Don't freak out, obviously. Focus on your breathing, focus on your feet, proper grip, in order to build your capacity to use lactate as fuel, right? That's the important part. And there won't be a video if my cat is not in it. So there you go. So the key will be Disney December when you feel you're about to lose it, because it will allow you to lower the sympathetic levels you have by raising the parasympathetic, and also just by making the blood move around, you'll be able to use a little bit of that lactate. But you also need on the side to do steady cardio at a fairly fast pace. You'll see what I mean. in order to be able to use the lactate as fuel. Remember, you are pumping fuel all day by being in an environment that you see as a threat. So you need to be able to use that lactate as energy. Otherwise, it turns against you and harms your body. That's what I've been saying. I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle of anxiety, right? Lactate as fuel, and what do we do with it? But again, at the end, the environment that you are in is putting you in a state of a constant panic attack. That will kill you over the long term and will have major physiological impact on you. So that's why we need to deal with as well. Cool. Thank you, guys.